And I believe that you coined the term DMT, the spirit molecule.
Right.
And
that's the
so
title of my first book.
and that is the title of your first book. Dr. Rick, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. Are you recording?
I am recording.
Oh, good. Okay, because somebody asked if you were. Well, thanks for having me, Daniel. Pleasure.
And so we're going to watch. Will you introduce what we're going to watch? We recorded this because I just want to tell everybody we recorded this because your internet's not so great. But if you would, what's going to happen is we're going to play this video and then we'll take some questions. We're going to run a little bit over an hour for this one. And yeah, would you please introduce?
Sure. Well, yeah, I recorded this talk a month or so ago because at that time my internet connection was really bad. And I've upgraded it quite a bit better, but still, I recorded it. So I think I, presented all the material in a pretty good way in the video. Well, yeah, it's a discussion of the comparison, the differentiation between different kinds of spiritual experiences that can be had with psychedelics. One is the prophetic. That's the paradigm of one type, which I call the interactive-relational, and the other is the mystical, which is more unitive, and the prevailing model is the mystical unitive for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is that it's the reigning paradigm for the research group studying psychedelics at Johns Hopkins. So I try to stir the pot, introduce some other ideas about ways to look at spirituality and the psychedelic drug experience, and to make my point or to exemplify the points I want to make. Instead of the mystical Eastern religious, New Age literature, I bring in the Hebrew Bible, which is a tough sell, but still I think it's got some merit to reconsider.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Those of you who are listening, what I encourage you to do is put your questions in the Q&A box. If you feel like chatting, of course, chat in the chat box. Put questions that you want us to address afterwards in the Q&A. And then, Rick, what I would suggest is that you and I will stop our cameras so that it doesn't get in the way of the video.
Okay. How would I do that? Stop video.
In the bottom corner, and then mute yourself as well.
Okay, so I'll mute. Greetings, everyone. Strassman from Mexico, and start screen sharing. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to present to this Montana Integration Jamboree. Looks like a great basket. So I'll be talking about two different models for.
Oh, we got to start that over. Sorry, folks. I got to click the different button. I got to click the button. Share sound and share. Apologies.
Spirituality, either the prophetic model or the mystical-unitive model. So the stakes are rather high because they're diametrically opposed models. In some ways, you could of an evolutionary dualism. So oftentimes people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, but spiritual experiences are spiritual experiences. The main Greetings, everyone. My name is Rick Strassman from New Mexico, and let me start screen sharing. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to present to this Mount Tam Integration Jamboree. Looks like a great roster, and I hope everybody's having a lot of fun. So I'll be talking about two different models for psychedelic spirituality, either the prophetic model or the mystical-unitive model. So the stakes are rather high because they're diametrically opposed models. In some ways, you could even see it as a battle for the soul of the psychedelic experience. One approach partakes of a militant universalism, and the other of an evolutionary dualism. So oftentimes people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, but spiritual experiences are spiritual experiences. The main difference is the container in which they take place. So if you belong to a traditional religion, a spiritual experience occurring within that context takes on the images and the ideas of that religious tradition. Otherwise, it's kind of independent of a religious tradition, but the phenomenology is the same. And even if one has a spiritual experience, or even if one calls oneself spiritual but not religious, if you ask enough questions or dig around a little, scratch below the surface, you will see that that person has got spiritual beliefs which could be described as constituting some kind of religious tradition or doctrine or conceptual framework. So the two types of spiritual experiences I call interactive and relational, and the paragon of that type is the prophetic, which I'll be describing later. And the other type is the mystical-unitive, which is the more popular model nowadays. And either of those can occur within or without a religious structure or a traditional religious structure. So the interactive relational type is full of content. The sense of a separate self is maintained. There's no ego dissolution. Interaction and relationship are the hallmark, rather than sort of a feeling of all is one. Time and space continue in some form or another, but there's no abolition of time and space. There's a feeling of what you're witnessing being more real than real. There's a certainty behind it, a portentousness, a truth. The mood effects are variable, usually astonishment or awe, but there can be fear, anxiety, there can be ecstasy, but that isn't especially the hallmark. And it's full of information, usually verbal or cognitive. So on the other side of the spectrum is what you might call the mystical-unitive state. There's a loss of the sense of self. It's free of images or content. There's merging in unity. There's no boundaries. There's no interaction per se. There's the transcendence or the abolition of time and space. And it's nonverbal, or what's called ineffable. That may be the case. It also may be the case that people just don't have the vocabulary to describe it. But in any event, that's one of the hallmarks, at least in current thinking. The main thing that this state shares with the interactive relational one is the feeling of certainty that what you're witnessing is more real than real. So let's jump into the subjective effects my volunteers described in the DMT study. People enter into a disembodied world of light, which is full of content and with which volunteers interact. And a frequent report is the encounter with beings, individually identifiable, that take any form or shape. And if they're not discretely identifiable, they're sensed. There's an intelligence that pervades the space. It's inhabited. And it feels more real than real. So if you read the DMT book, my DMT book, The Spirit Molecule, I catalog a huge number of people's experiences. And let me just jump to the conclusions. The experiences are absolutely dependent on the volunteer's individual psyche. An urban shaman had a shamanic experience. A nurse with a long-standing interest in near-death states had an NDE. The only mystical experience took place in someone who was a religious studies major in college and had been hoping for, working on, developing preparation for a mystical experience. A software designer beheld a platonic world of ones and zeros. A couple of people with some minor symptoms of PTSD experienced healing. So one of the questions that I brought to my DMT study was whether DMT was inherently spiritual. Was the pharmacology of the molecule somehow spiritual, intrinsically, inherently? And I had to conclude that the answer was no. With the minimal preparation that we gave volunteers, people just underwent their own trip. They just had their own trip. In a lot of psychotherapy studies, even spiritual experience studies, people receive a lot of preparation, education, orientation, 10 to 12 hours. And we gave just a few minutes of preparation, telling volunteers it was fast, it was short, it was disembodied. We'll keep an eye out for their health. Otherwise, I just wanted them to keep their eyes open, so to speak, to observe carefully, keep their wits about them, and to report what they underwent once they came down. So with that minimal preparation, expectations, those kinds of pre-existing overlays, people just experienced what the interaction was of the drug and their mind, their personalities. And Stan Groff a number of years ago called psychedelics non-specific amplifiers of the unconscious. But I think they're non-specific amplifiers of the conscious mind as well. They make things you may not be certain of more certain. They clarify questions that you're puzzling over. So not necessarily working to bring unconscious things to consciousness. And with respect to the content, it was pretty personal and psychological. There weren't really many cosmic insights. Instead, the most articulated descriptions were of the state itself rather than the information that people extracted from that state. And the information extracted was, as I mentioned, rather everyday. It was more profound, but it was still quite related to their personalities and their lives. So this brings us to the notion of set and setting. One of the recent developments is from Ido Hartogson from Israel, who calls these drugs meaning enhancing. And in a way, they're super placebos. They make you undergo, or they cause what you want them to cause, which returns to the importance of the model. So the model determines a lot of what you undergo or what you experience. It determines who participates. If you're terminally ill, you'll participate in a terminally ill study. If you're depressed, you'll participate in a depression study with the hope that your depression will improve. You also are open to having things or to experience a unusual acute state of mind brought on by a psychedelic drug. You might be afraid of losing your mind. You undergo certain kind of preparation. If, for example, you're in a mystical experience study, you're not going to be oriented towards depression resolution in the preparation. The management of your acute experience also is determined by the model. If you're in a study that has the mystical experience as the goal, that's the way your acute experience is going to be managed, how it's going to be guided, with the goal in mind of that experience. The suggestions that are made will be made in order to make that experience, that goal, more likely to take place. Also the interpretation integration. If you've got cancer, your experiences will be interpreted in the light of your illness. If you're working on your meditation being better, you'll be directed, for example, to spiritual texts, rather than specific or consistent with the tradition or the model that's being utilized. If it's a meditation study, you're not going to be referred to the Hebrew Bible to understand what just took place. So you could look at the two ends of the spectrum regarding the models as well. One might be the mystical-mimetic model, where you want to merge with everything, have an ecstatic, blissful state. The other would be the Charles Manson model, where you volunteer because you're psychopathic. You want to get revenge on the larger society. You want to raise hell, create chaos and anarchy. And you take LSD with Charles Manson, and you're more convinced of a particular model that comports with what you bring to the session in the first place. So instead of being just vaguely psychopathic, you become a dedicated serial killer because you're convinced that your salvation hinges on that behavior and those beliefs. So in summary, psychedelics act on who you are. They don't act on someone else, and they don't act independent of who you are. They're chemicals, they're drugs that affect your brain-mind complex, only your brain-mind complex. So at a certain point, I turned to religious models for understanding my results from the DMT study. They also concern themselves with things that you might refer to as previously invisible. At the end of my study and at the end of the DMT book, I consider various locations for the DMT world, either inner or outer or some combination thereof. And it's just hard to tell. So I think a more generic way of understanding the location of the DMT world is that it was previously invisible and is revealed through the effects of DMT. So religious models also contend themselves with things previously invisible. There's the foundational assumption that what you're witnessing is more real than real. One of the advantages of religious models is that they've labored mightily over the millennia to extract theoretically and practically relevant information from the state. In other words, what does the experience tell us about the nature of the spiritual worlds and their relationship to us? And what's the practical implications of the information that we have gained from those experiences regarding the nature of spiritual worlds? The spiritual model I brought to bear on my studies was Buddhism, but specifically Zen Buddhism. If I had been steeped in the Tibetan tradition, I would have probably approached or taken into consideration Buddhist religious models differently. But the Zen model I brought to bear on this study emphasized the goal of Kensho, Satori, enlightenment, which phenomenologically is a mystical unitive state. There's ego dissolution, there's an emptiness to the experience. And visions, voices are deemed to be unreal, just things that the mind is kind of shedding on the way toward the content-free goal. I also looked into shamanic models, but not very extensively. What I understood or understand, at least from my cursory examination, is that shamanism treats the visions and the voices as real. The entities are real. They have effects on our lives. But the model for healing the universe of shamanism is filled with warfare and counter warfare. If you're currently sick, it's because you've been cursed, and if you're healed, that turns the curse back onto the original cursor, who then has to curse you back or curse the patient back. So it just seemed a bit Byzantine in a way, and it is at least ostensibly atheistic. The spirits are real, but there's no overlord, so to speak. There's no one God who creates and sustains the whole system. It's more of a pantheon, I suppose. So here's the book I wrote about DMT and the prophetic experience, which turns out to be the paradigmatic interactive relational state. So I propose it as an alternative to what might be called the psychedelic religion of unitive mystical consciousness, which is the predominant spiritual model and even the therapeutic model in the research and non-research worlds. It's the white light, ego dissolving beyond language state, which is a goal. And like with every goal, you strive for it. If you attain it, you feel pride and accomplishment. If you don't, you feel disappointment, a sense of failure. And this holds for both the person taking the drug and the person administering the drug. I mean, I can speak from experience. When people didn't have a huge DMT experience for any number of reasons, I felt kind of let down, and the volunteer kind of felt let down as well. And that's even more the case when you have established as a goal the mystical state. One of the basic tenets of the mystical unitive model of research is that it underlies all major religions, but that's not true. If you read the Hebrew Bible, there's not one example of a mystical unitive state. They are only interactive and relational. So why do we need an alternative? I mean, isn't the mystical unitive state cool? Well, it is, but most psychedelic experiences are not. They're interactive and relational. And we live in an interactive relational world. It isn't that we need to get high or ego dissolve. We need to use our ego in a better way. We need to learn superior means of managing our interactive relational world, both with ourselves, with other people, and the external environment. In addition, the wordless nature of the mystical experience provides, I think, the opportunity for abuse. You could just make things up as you go along. You come down and somebody tells you what that white light unitive ego dissolving state means. But that lends itself to projection, to taking advantage of someone who's in a vulnerable, open-minded, confused condition, like, what was that? And you could say, oh, it was this. It means you need to donate to my cause, or it means you need to sleep with me, or it means there's no difference between good and evil. So if you've got a cognitive verbal state or information extracted from an interactive relational experience, that lends itself to a text, to writing down what you heard. And then you can refer to it as a benchmark and when you need guidance later on. I'm going to pause for a moment. It's important to have an alternative also because of the more or less explicit antagonism to interactive relational psychedelic experiences. Somehow there's a feeling that they're not as good, that they're the foothills versus the mountain peaks, which implies a certain theological perspective that mystical religion is superior to non-mystical religion. And there's just no evidence for that. It's an opinion, which is then turned into an assertion of fact. So let's look at the mystical model. So first of all, I want to point out that the mystical model that's emanated out of Hopkins has been extraordinarily useful. It's been adopted by a lot of other research groups in the US and abroad. The effects are quite profoundly positive, generally across the board, for all manner of conditions, circumstances, goals, smoking cessation, depression from terminal illness, depression, a number of different clinical indications. But it's not perfect. And one of the shortcomings is the orientation toward the goal of a mystical experience, which isn't always something which is had. So there was a paper that was published. Well, there were two papers, one from NYU and one from Hopkins, describing using psilocybin for terminally ill patients, their existential angst. There was a suicide that took place in the Hopkins study, and you only can find out about it by tracking down the supplemental material, which is independent of the main paper online. If you read the main paper, they describe no adverse effects of psilocybin. So in this case, the person got a very, very low non-psychoactive dose of psilocybin. And obviously there was no mystical experience. So when you make the goal of treatment a particular state and you give a dose of drug that's not very likely to cause that state, you're going to it's going to result in a disheartened and frustrated patient who, from my own experience, would consider it a complete wash. And what's the point? So 11 days later, they killed themselves. So strictly speaking, it's not an adverse effect of the drug, but it's clearly an adverse effect of the model. If the model was more geared, for example, to just interacting with your own mind, with the people in the room, without the high hopes of a transformative mystical experience, the outcome would likely have been different. So what is the model that takes the interactive relational spiritual experience as as the paradigm? Well, by a number of circumstances, I was led to the prophetic state of the Hebrew Bible. So most people think about prophecy as foretelling or predicting, but that is the result of a translational artifact. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, which was the first non-Hebrew language translation, the word for prophet was translated as the word for diviner, to predict or to foretell. And that's because of the Greek emphasis on prediction and divining, so to speak, as the goal of spiritual experience. But a more broad definition of the prophetic experience of prophecy is any spiritual state which is occurring in any figure in the Hebrew Bible. So the medieval philosophers who provide me most of the intellectual guideposts for understanding the prophetic state divide prophetic experience into up to 10 different categories, 10 different types, from higher to lower, like a hierarchy, so to speak. And there are lower levels of prophetic experience, which could be simply inspiration, courage, and can then extend, or they could range all the way up to out-of-body experiences, visions, and voices speaking to angels or to God. So prediction may occur, but it usually does not. And even when predictions occur, they can be rather vague and not that useful. So one of the canonical prophets, the for whom a book is named. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah are some of the canonical prophets. Ezekiel had very psychedelic visions. He lived in modern day Iraq, Babylonia, about 2,700 years ago, with the rest of the exiles who were transported to Babylonia after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And here's the initiatory vision, quite psychedelic. There's a stormy wind, flashing bright cloud with a surrounding brilliance, semblance of four creatures. And the creatures were fiery. There was lightning. There was a intense roaring sound, great waters, that sound of a company, weakness, loss of motor control, a voice speaking to him. A few paragraphs further down in chapter 1, the angel grabs Ezekiel by the hair and pulls him into outer space. So why did I end up looking at Hebrew Bible prophecy? Well, there were some synchronistic circumstances. I had parted ways with my Zen community, and it was over the issue of the relationship between the psychedelic experience and Buddhist practice. Most of the junior monks that I had become friends with in my 20s experienced the first flash of enlightenment on LSD, and they wouldn't have become monks, almost all of them told me, if it weren't for that first flash of enlightenment on LSD. We had fruitful conversations over the intervening 20 years, but once I actually began my studies and writing about them and speaking about them and kind of speaking about LSD and Zen in the same breath, things came to a head, so to speak. So I needed to find myself a new spiritual home, as it were. And I'm Jewish, so I returned to my Jewish roots and began looking at the Bible. But also I was looking for a model that took into account the data derived from my DMT study, which is you give a huge dose of DMT and it's not a mystical state, it's an interactive relational one. So I compared the two states, the DMT state and the prophetic state. As I was reading the Bible, there were just a lot of descriptions of spiritual experience, which seemed very DMT-like. And so the majority of the book, my Prophetic States book, is an undertaking of comparing the two experiences. And I believe that to the extent they overlap, there was a similar ongoing biology. And if there were significant overlapping and there were significant, at least speculatively, common biological processes, then perhaps the two states could inform and help guide each other. So the Hebrew Bible, it's our spiritual text of the West. Here's a pithy quote from the book of Proverbs, emphasizing staying within our own tradition, if we can anyway. It's the foundation of Western civilization and the three monotheistic religions. I've got Islam in parentheses because even though Islam refers a lot to the Hebrew Bible, they don't depend on it for their legitimacy, whereas Christianity does. And it isn't the Old Testament. That's a bit of a disparaging moniker that was placed on it by Christians. So it's the Hebrew Bible rather than the Old Bible, so to speak. It underlies Western theology, psychology, politics, everything pretty much. And it's clearly powerful, influential, and enduring. And it's been misused horribly, even, well, especially today. Or it's, I guess, never stopped being misused and abused and used to power trip, subject, to oppression, subdue. So, because it is so powerful, it's worth us re-examining it. Can we reclaim it for a more elevated use? And can our psychedelic experience help us uh, reclaim it? So, the answer at this point is no. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the Marin TEDx, and I told them where my studies had recently taken me. And they basically said, this won't go over well. Most of our audience is Buddhist. But it's kind of ironic because that's the location of Spirit Rock, the Vipassana Center. And many of the teachers and students there are Jewish. So um, they believe that discussing DMT through the lens of the Hebrew Bible would be religious, and they were about science. But just a few months before, there was a TED talk by Joan Halifax on Buddhist compassion. So I pointed that out, and they said, well, Buddhism really isn't a religion. But you look at Wikipedia, you look anywhere, Buddhism is a religion. So there's a discrimination, a knee-jerk emotional repugnance to discussing the Hebrew Bible as a spiritual text, and even more specifically as one that could help us understand psychedelic experience. So I think what that described, or was an example of, was the emotional response to the text. It's an evil book, but it isn't really. It's just a strong, powerful book that's been put to evil uses. It's like saying nuclear fission is evil. It can be used for evil purposes, or it can be used for beneficial ones. So I think you need to distinguish between the contents and how they've been applied. So there's a couple of approaches. One is to do your mindfulness meditation and take a breath. The other is to approach it intellectually. And after all, that's why we have frontal lobes, right? To manage our emotions. And intellectually, there's resistances as well, that it's a myth, it's not true, makes no sense, contradicts itself. So one approach is to suspend your disbelief. And by suspending your disbelief, you're saying to yourself, if this were real, where would that lead us? Where would that lead me? So it's kind of like what I ended up doing in my reaction to descriptions of the DMT world. My volunteers were clear it was more real than real. It was a real world. It wasn't just imaginary. It wasn't myth. It wasn't not true. It wasn't like it'd make no sense. It's a real world, more real than this one. So I had to do a thought experiment and tell myself, okay, if it is real, keep an open mind. You learn what it's like. You start to learn the terrain. You learn who the inhabitants are, what their language is, what their mode of interaction and currency is. So you can do this, the identical thing with the Hebrew Bible. You can take it at face value. You could say, okay, let me let me do a thought experiment that the world of the Hebrew Bible is real. And if that's the case, who are the characters? What are the laws that regulate it? What's the teaching? Who are the people? Um, so that is one of the ways I got more comfortable with the world of the Hebrew Bible. Once you begin studying it, it becomes clear that it's a chronicle, it's a history, it's a manual, it's a catalog of God's relationship with mankind. So when you're studying it, it's impossible to read without a program. And the best programs are those, or the best commentaries, the best way of entering into the world of the Hebrew Bible is with the aid of the medieval Jewish commentators. And there's a half a dozen English translations of their work is available. And they basically approach the text through the language and common sense. Oh, one point is I'm only talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Bible. I'm not talking about Kabbalah. I'm not talking about Chassidut. I'm not talking about Jewish mysticism. I'm not talking about Jewish mystical experiences. I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, 24 books that were compiled millennia ago, that were closed about 2,000 years ago. So it just keeps things much more simple. When you start getting into Kabbalah, there's contamination from all other kinds of cross-cultural currents, Hasidism as well. So it's a pure culture of traditional Judaism. And even among Jews, it's a hard sell because people just automatically want to veer into Kabbalah and Chassidut and the Orthodoxy and all that. But this is a lot simpler. So let's look at the effects of a careful reading of one of the narratives, which is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden after eating of the tree, or the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A lot of people in the psychedelic community will point to this episode as an example of an anti-psychedelic bent of the Hebrew Bible, that Adam and Eve ate a psychedelic mushroom, they attained to knowledge, God got jealous and kicked them out. But if you read the text carefully, they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was the tree of knowledge, or the tree of entering into subjective reality. Before that, they lived in the world of truth. So before they ate from the tree, they were not embarrassed of being nude. After they ate of the tree, they were embarrassed of being nude. It's in the text. You read it, black and white. And they then also tried to hide from God, which also makes no sense. So they became square pegs, and they no longer fit into round holes, the round hole of the world of truth. They were a square peg now, living in or experiencing the world of good and bad, pretty and ugly. So they just weren't able to fit into that world anymore. They lost their qualifications. In a way, they became dumber. So this is the result of a careful reading of the text rather than a knee-jerk reaction. So what are the principles that are contained in the text? Well, they're regarding belief and behavior, and the summary of the main belief is in one God, rather than in many gods, or in idol worship, or in worshiping man's creations like money and fame. And behaviorally, that's the golden rule: you love your fellow as yourself. And all of the rest of the precepts devolve from this one precept. So for most of us, the idea of God is a tough one. And there's a great quote in I and Thou about the legitimate use of the word God being denied because it's been so badly misused. But because it's been so badly misused, that's the reason we need to pay attention to it, to study it, to plumb what it entails. So, how I got God was through Buddhism. It was through a careful examination of cause and effect. Because cause and effect teaches that everything is created and passes away, then cause and effect must be created and pass away. And so, if that's the case, what preceded and what will follow cause and effect? So, I had a flash one day that, oh, that's how, or that's one way to define God. Something that came before cause and effect, created it, keeps it going, and will exist after it passes away. So when you look at cause and effect, it's the way the natural world and the moral, ethical worlds work, how they operate. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, ecology, behavior, politics. There's cause and effect. And you can infer the mind of God that created cause and effect by looking at natural and moral laws. Because cause and effect is not random. Certain things are encouraged, certain things are discouraged. So, what is God? Well, first and foremost, God has no genitals because God is invisible and incorporeal. And that's why the kerfuffle over the he pronoun for God is kind of misguided. It's an artifact of the Hebrew language, which doesn't have an it pronoun. It's all pronouns, nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives are either masculine or are feminine, and the masculine is the default, like Spanish. And because of God being incorporeal, it needs to interact with the corporeal universe, and this occurs through intermediaries, which are the angels or the beings. One of the stumbling blocks in reading the Bible is the notion of reward and punishment. But I think also, this is an artifact. There's a notion that the Bible speaks in the words of humankind, that it speaks in an easily understandable set of concepts. And to instruct the masses in the workings of cause and effect just would be too difficult for the majority to understand. It's easier to anthropomorphize cause and effect. In other words, if cause and effect were a person, then you doing good and things resulting from your doing good being good, an easy way of understanding that is you're being rewarded. And if you do bad and bad things happen to you, because of how cause and effect are set up, if that were occurring under the auspices of a human, you would understand it as that you did bad and you're being punished. But it's not really the case. It's just an operation of cause and effect. And you can see the results, or you can see examples in ecology. If you are, if you're consistently, farming, over farming, there's going to be, famine ultimately because the land stops producing. So, that could be understood as, cause and effect. It's the law of nature, or because of a more, simple anthropomorphic way of understanding it, you could read the text which states you must give the land a break every 7 years, and if you don't, there'll be trouble. And you could then interpret the famine as being punished by God for not following that precept. But it's simply the working of cause and effect. And it can also be applicable to health. If you're angry, it causes heartburn. That's just the way the natural world is uh, uh, set up. And it's also explicated in the Bible as don't be angry, don't carry a grudge, don't seek revenge. So returning to the prophetic state, there are catalysts, the fervor of crowds, or being isolated, or abstaining from things, or extreme pleasure, food, music. Being close to death can catalyze prophecy. Certain techniques, prayer, postures, rituals. There's no evidence in the text of exogenous plants, mushrooms, or fungi, and the existence of naturally occurring DMT in the brain is enough to support the notion that psychedelics are playing a role in some of the phenomenology of the prophetic state. There's been speculation about tryptamines in the burning acacia bush, ergot alkaloids in manna. But if you read the text carefully, there's no evidence whatsoever of people taking things to get high or to alter their consciousness. The only example is wine or liquor. So once I started to read the Hebrew Bible, I was impressed with the prophetic state as being quite psychedelic. And the phenomenological overlap is striking between the DMT and prophetic states. Visions, and voices, somatic experiences, emotional reactions. One of the interesting sidelights of my study of prophetic experience is the notion of kavod, or God's glory, which is more typical of the 5-methoxy DMT experience. It's more of the white light. The perceptual characteristics are much less differentiated. It's powerful, it's overwhelming, mostly nonverbal. It's the cloud, it's the fire. And interestingly enough, it's beheld by the masses, not the prophets themselves, like Moses or Jeremiah. So it might be lower level than the more well-articulated prophetic state, which has more features in common with the DMT one. So as I've been describing, the prophetic state is interactive and relational. And the main purpose of the relationship is to communicate. There are other functions of the relationship: to guard, to bless, to heal, or it's not quite clear what exactly is going on. But the main function is to communicate. And the communication is verbal, is words. There's a message, there's information which is transmitted. So, besides the notion of one God, the behavioral information or guidelines which are transmitted is the golden rule. So it's in Leviticus. It isn't the more commonly understood version of do unto others as you wish them to do unto you, which is more self-serving if you think about it. The actual golden rule in Leviticus is love your fellow as yourself, which is more difficult on both counts. First, you need to love yourself, and then you need, to love your fellow. And there's quite a few permutations. What you don't like, don't, do to other people. What you don't like, or, what you don't do to other people, don't do to yourself. So that's a fairly open-ended precept. So let's start comparing the religious, the prophetic religion with a mystical religion. Prophecy is verbal. The information is baked into the experience. there's the spoken word. There's no accounts of mystical experience in the Hebrew Bible. And if you have questions in this day and age, you return to the text, which is a prophetic text. In the mystical religion, the cognitive interpretation is an overlay. You make it up as you go along, what feels right. And if you have questions, you have to return to that mystical state, which can lend itself to abuse. So the manual, the textbook, the Bible, so to speak, of the mystical or the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness is a book by Bill Richards called Sacred Knowledge. And it's the basis of the Hopkins therapeutic model. Bill is quite clear that his first, psychedelic experiences were supervised by Hans Karl Leuner. And if you look on Wikipedia under Hans Karl Leuner, one of the earliest, or in one of the first, paragraphs, it states that he was a psychiatrist who served in Hitler's armed forces. So that's a bit of a strange thing. It isn't stated explicitly that he was a Nazi, but still, he worked for Hitler. So Bill also is a acolyte of Carl Jung. And if you read Carl Jung's non-translated German work, he's quite clear that Jews cannot be analyzed. And they can't be analyzed because, unlike the Germans, they don't have a relationship to the soil like the Germans do. And this belief and teaching of Jung is explicated quite clearly in a book by Doe called Jung's Wandering Archetype, all about his belief in the Jewish inability to attain spiritual enlightenment, so to speak. So, Daniel wanted me to be controversial when he invited me to give this lecture. So this is probably my most controversial slide. I will propose that Bill's book, Sacred Knowledge, should be book burned, ought to be burned. He denigrates of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. He denigrates scripture, saying, oh, it didn't come out of the sky and bonk somebody on the head. And that if, God forbid, the scripture disappeared, they could be replaced. And as an example of a replacement of scripture, at the end of the book, in an appendix, he offers his 13 insights, outdoing Moses by 3. He glorifies Jesus, Plato, Paul, Christianity, Eastern religions. He hints at psychedelics ushering in the second coming of Christ. He describes 2 problematic patients of his and makes clear that they're both Jewish. So earlier on, I commented that the model used at Hopkins is quite effective and quite good. So as opposed to the to my belief that the Bible is a good book that's been put to evil use, this book is an evil book that's been put to good use. So that's my soapbox about sacred knowledge. So let me take another brief break after that rampage, and we will wrap up. So the whole point of the lecture is the relationship between the text, the Hebrew Bible, prophetic states, and contemporary psychedelic use. So to the extent that psychedelics do replicate features of the prophetic experience, they enhance our resonance with the prophetic state out of which the text emerged. So that is one of the key points of the whole discussion. If the visions and the voices resemble those brought on by DMT also occur in the prophetic state, that means that there's some commonality in the mind-brain complex. And the prophetic state is the state out of which the Hebrew Bible emerged. And you could read the text. And if you are psychedelicized, you attain a closer proximity to the prophetic state, at least to the extent that the two resemble each other. Practical implications of that notion is that it can help us understand the moral, ethical teachings embedded in the narratives, the laws, the poetry, the wisdom literature, because we don't just need a Jewish version of the mystical experience. We need to relate to the world and ourselves and our environment in a better way. And okay, that's enough. It can provide, guidelines for the interactive relational spiritual experience and the interactive relational world that we live in. So optimizing your experience. Well, if you want to attain to being closer to the prophetic state, you immerse yourself, you prepare yourself along those lines. You study, you pray, ritual diet, keep kosher for a couple of weeks, let's say. You would choose your music carefully. Wagner, which plays a prominent, role in the Hopkins playlist, was played at the death camps during the separations, where people were deemed to go to the gas chambers right away or to the barracks. And even if you weren't a concentration camp survivor, there's got to be some kind of resonance in your mind or response, if you're Jewish, to hearing Wagner. So you would consider other music, Israeli folk songs, your prayers in Hebrew, those kinds of things. You would also choose your accoutrements with certain ideas in mind. Would it be a Buddha statue? Would it be Jesus on the cross? Would it be the tablets that contain the 10 Commandments? The way you manage the acute effects of the drug also would be determined by your model, which in this case would be more oriented towards the interactive, relational, prophetic one. So there are many cases in the text of confused, prophets. They don't understand what they're seeing, or they're frightened, or they're disoriented. And they have, or in the text, in the narratives, are examples of asking questions, reorienting yourselves, asking for help. So you could expand your toolbox for interacting with the psychedelic experience by learning how the prophets interacted with their interactive relational states. With respect to integration, my generic definition of integration is you want to occupy yourself with what reminds you of the best of your psychedelic experiences, what makes you feel and think the same kinds of things. So for me, oddly enough, it turned out to be studying the Hebrew Bible with a commentator by my side. But it would differ, between and among people. But if you do want to inculcate prophetic consciousness or a prophetic mentality, you would study after your experience. And it would help you clarify what just took place. It would provide guidance, inspiration, for example. And also, it would help you, or it could, lead to a community of like-minded seekers. The commentators, even though they're long gone, but there are also, good contemporary commentaries. live teachers, peers. So when I was earlier talking about this being a battle for the soul of the psychedelic experience, I wasn't really exaggerating. On one hand is the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness, or the mystical religion of psychedelic consciousness. In either event, it's a militant universalism. It's predicated on the notion that all religions have got the mystical experience as their foundational experience, but that's not true. And whose universal religion is it? There can be competing universal religions. Is it Advaita? Is it Vedanta? Is it mystical Christianity? Is it New Age? And what if you don't agree with the universal religion? And also the militant part of it is the emphasis on the mystical experience. You must have this mystical experience, or else you're second class, or your set of circumstances, you need to return to that mystical experience. So I think for these reasons, and probably a number of extra ones, it's a little bit of a structured worldview. So I guess all worldviews are structured, but it's always good to have competing worldviews. So if you don't like the one, you can become involved with the other. So the other is the one that I've been describing, which is the prophetic model of interactive relational experience. And the scaffolding, the structure, the cognitive model is what one might call evolutionary dualism. We live in a dualistic world. Our spiritual experiences are dualistic. But that's just, how things are now. That isn't the way things will always be. But it is how things are now. And to pretend otherwise can be a problem. So, the goal, if there is a goal, is to recognize and to serve the one God, but we are not there yet. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But it's the goal to which we are going to be evolving as a species, as a race, as a manifestation of nature. So history is moving in that direction, and we can get a glimpse of that history through the text. God's involvement with history, with humans, with nature. And your relationship with the text anchors the holy dualism. It is this world spirituality. It isn't an incorporeal spirituality of oneness. It's what you do with your neighbor, what you do with your land, what you do with your health, what you eat, what you say, what you think, what you feel. There isn't any emphasis in the Bible on mystical states, on the afterlife, and there's even very few references to the messianic era of how things will be on this earth when things are formed as a result of the Messiah coming, which is a whole different discussion. But clearly the Messiah has not yet come. So key points. There's overlap between the phenomenology of prophetic and the DMT states. The Hebrew Bible is a prophetic text, and it is relevant to the contemporary psychedelic experience, if you want it to be. It can help us understand what we're experiencing during our psychedelic states. It can help us optimize our experiences by guiding them, adding new tools to our armamentarium, integrating our experiences. So a point I make earlier on is psychedelics act on who you are. So if you want to be if you want more spiritual trips, you need to work on becoming a more spiritual person. Uh, Psychedelics only act on who you are. They don't act on who you aren't. And so they can help you grow weeds as well as grow flowers. Um, so this is more or less a repetition. Uh, you can more deeply resonate with the text when you're in a psychedelic state. Studying the texts produce a psychedelic-like experience. And the key point is to be better people, to promote world peace rather than your own enlightenment, which may or may not occur. But in the meantime, you want to be a better person. So the prophetic model provides an alternative for understanding, applying, and integrating the contemporary psychedelic experience. And it's interactive and relational, as are most of our psychedelic experiences, and as is most of our life. It's God-oriented. It's a model combining pharmacology with intellectual training. You study, you learn, and it utilizes an immensely powerful text, which we may be able to reclaim its power for good through the judicious interaction of that text with the psychedelic state. Okay, so thank you very much for paying attention. And now I will take questions. And once again, thanks for tuning in.
All right, fantastic. Everybody still with us? Dr. Rick, you still with us? We've got several questions. People seem to love it. It's so funny to see you in a different shirt now.
Well, during the video, I was thinking, damn, I'm not wearing that same blue shirt. I should go and put it on. But I was just, so enamored. Well, I wouldn't say enamored, but I rarely, watch my own videos.
Right.
So
the vest is still over the back of the chair, though. That's nice.
Right. I keep my tallis back there. It's my blankie.
All right. Let me just find. Can you speak to, Tim wants to know, can you speak to some examples of interactive relational experiences?
So, when the video was playing, I cut and paste the questions I wanted to address. So maybe I could start with, doing that.
Awesome.
Yeah. So let's see. Somebody asked if I have any studies currently running, and I don't. I haven't done any hands-on studies for a long time, the last being 1995. I still consult to academic groups, nonprofits, pharma. I have students here and there. I review manuscripts which have been submitted for consideration of being published in scientific journals, and I review those. So I both keep current on what's going on in the research world, and through my editorial comments, try to direct it in a certain direction. So I'm still active in the field, but I'm not doing any of my own studies. So somebody asked, would you say a super placebo might work by making a person more suggestible, possibly making a feedback loop that makes the chemical even more effective? Well, that's a good question. I think any placebo works through suggestibility, among other things. but I think suggestibility plays a big role. So, for example, you could study people before they participate in a research project and get a measurement of their suggestibility or hypnotizability, which are quite closely related. And there are some simple screening tools. And then you could see if the results corresponded to the degree of suggestibility. If you're more suggestible, does that mean your response to whatever it is you're participating in is that much greater? So the feedback loop, along the line of placebo, you know, it might explain why psychedelics seem to be beneficial for everything. So that's one way to explain that phenomenon. And also, placebo doesn't mean imaginary. There are biological components of the placebo response. So placebo activates your innate physical and psychological healing mechanisms. And it all occurs behind the scenes. You're not conscious of that happening, which leads into the notion that you could see and benefit from non-psychedelic psychedelics. That's like a huge area in the research world now. If you, like, for example, you blockade the effects, the subjective effects of a psychedelic with some pharmacological drug, will the antidepressant effect, for example, still result? And a few weeks ago, there was an animal report or a report studying animals where that seemed to be the case. In a mouse model of depression, you could block the psychedelic effects, but there was still an improvement. And the fact that we have DMT in our brains at quite high concentrations, like almost like serotonin, dopamine, those kinds of neurotransmitters, there could be a DMT neurotransmitter system in the brain, which you could suggest might be mediating the placebo effect if in the non-psychedelic state, so to speak. But because it's a placebo that the brain makes, that may be how the placebo effect works in other cases. Somebody asked about interactive relational experiences, so I think we covered that in the talk. Have I established any connections with the Akashic records, Vajrayana Buddhism, and or Pachamama? Well, my studies of the subjective effects, the reports of volunteers, basically demonstrated that if somebody is into the Akashic records, for example, that's the way they would view their experiences. Oh, this confirms what the Akashic records has said. Or if you're a Vajrayana Buddhist, we had one, and he said, well, this is an example of some Vajrayana notion or practice, and shamanism as well. So it isn't that I would make connections between Akashic records and so on, but people who are immersed in whatever worldviews get those worldviews amplified, modified, clarified. I was in one of their studies in 2013, I guess one of Johns Hopkins studies. The protocol has 2 doses, 1 month apart, no placebo. One was a low dose, one was a full dose. Yeah, that's how you do studies. You need a placebo or an active placebo to compare with a full dose of a drug in order to determine that it's the drug. So I'm not sure of the sequence of administration of psilocybin to that person who committed suicide. There's very little information about that case. There's, she got agitated and this and that, but you don't. I think a case report on that suicide would be extraordinarily helpful to the field. For one reason, it's because it would not appear as if suicides in psilocybin studies aren't being reported, which would be a bad thing to start having people believe. You want to really have transparency at this early stage of the game. The other is that by carefully examining that session and its aftermath, valuable lessons could be gleaned that would be helpful for subsequent studies with psilocybin, other drugs, terminally ill studies on other studies. So I think it would be good for PR at the very least. Like, this is a bad result that occurred in our study, not from the drug, but in our study. And then for people to be able to debate it and discuss it and learn from it rather than kind of sweeping it under the rug. Have my studies informed the divinity powers of me or my cohorts? Well, my volunteers, there was one woman that the police would occasionally inquire of her psychic abilities to locate lost people. And there was a case or two she was working on, but she didn't have any breakthroughs, even though she tried as part of her session. My divinatory powers, well, I don't think so. Have I got a vision for the future? Well, that's very clever. Yeah, I think that psychedelics are really blooming. So I'd like to see them used for the good, the greater good. There's going to be competing camps, make money, help people, hopefully both. I think our understanding of consciousness is going to be really shaken up by studying endogenous DMT. Terence used to talk about how, why isn't the DMT story on the front page of the New York Times? There's this substance that you smoke, and within a heartbeat or two, you're in a very interesting place consistently. And that's the University of Michigan studies, demonstrating DMT synthesis in the rodent brain at levels as high as serotonin and dopamine. That's really mind-blowing that there's this DMT, potentially a independent neurotransmitter system in the brain. So what does that say about our understanding of reality, even more so than the placebo effect, which I think are interwoven, but that's an obscure topic. Staying with, yeah, that's funny. That quotation from the book of Proverbs about drinking from your own cistern. Somebody said, somebody just quoted me that as a basis for drinking one's own urine for health. So I didn't know that. Psychedelics seem like the suppressed missing link to the Bible, the missing key to the Bible. Well, I think that it isn't, psychedelics are the key, but it's, psychedelic consciousness. That's the key to understanding a lot of the Bible. So it isn't that you need to find some herb or something in the Hebrew Bible, but we can experience psychedelic consciousness. And that will help us, I think, understand the Bible and prophecy more deeply. The Kabbalistic path, rather than Orthodox, Reformed, or others, is insightful. And the founder of Hasidism was remarkable. Well, that's true. I'm not putting down Kabbalah, and I'm not building up Orthodox or Reformed. I'm saying the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah, the 24 books. The Kabbalah, Hasidut, all the sects, the foundational text of all of those streams is the Hebrew Bible. Everything else is an afterthought or a development. So it's kind of like you want to do, calculus before you learn arithmetic. I mean, you might just be happy spending your life in arithmetic, which is the way I've gone. Oh, The Immortality Key. Yeah, great book. You should read it. But I think it's also important to keep in mind what I was saying about drugs only work on who you are. So if you were an early Christian, that's the culture and the mindset you were in all of the time. So you take a psychedelic or some mind-altering substance, and you become very dedicated to the cause in a way you weren't before. It seems truer than ever before. You can riff off of basic notions into more highly articulated corollaries of those basic notions and spread the word intellectually. So those things occur in a more or less conscious, or those substances work on material that's more or less conscious, pre-existing. So it isn't like you take a drug and you're somebody different. You're just more of who you are. Can psychedelic mysticism liberate Israel from Orthodox hegemony? You've come to the wrong lecture, as somebody advised me one day to say. If stumped, you've come to the wrong lecture. The Jews may not have been beholden to European soil. Didn't Jung consider their connection to the soil of the first and second temple? Not really. From what I understand, he believed that the Jews' primary connection was to the Bible, was the Talmud, their books, the text, which was portable. And so, somehow wasn't as earthy or grounded or, something as the Aryan soul or psyche. It's a deep-rooted belief. I think before accepting these models, we need to dig into their origins. Do they not incorporate teleportation to Israel in their prayers? Well, I understand that, the Midrash anyway states that if you die outside of the land of Israel, that you're somehow transported underground, to Israel for the resurrection. But that's out of my area of expertise. Even though there's no mention of psychedelics in the Bible, could there have been other plants in the wine? There could have been, but I'll tell you, you can spend your life looking for plants in the Bible. But the important thing is we have DMT in our minds, in our brains, available to us. And we have the text, the information, the message in the text. So by looking for plants, we're missing the message. What are the ideas that have endured? Not necessarily what plants did they take. My prayer and meditation is always just me talking to the divine, and I get mad for not being able to get to quiet. Well, don't get mad at yourself. Compassion starts at home. Can you endorse cannabis as a worthy substitute? As Daniel McQueen did or is doing. Yeah, Daniel McQueen wrote a book recently, Psychedelic Cannabis, and it's all about taking big doses of cannabis very quickly, like a huge amount, super strong, super many puffs, and then lying down on a mat with eye shades and tripping out. And it's quite DMT-like. Do I describe myself as non-dualistic? How can you describe yourself as non-dualistic?
Who's the one doing the describing?
Right, exactly. Who's describing?
So
from what I've read, DMT gives a more relational experience than 5-methoxy. Right. Exactly. That's the point I make, especially around kavod, God's glory, which is it's more typical of a 5-methoxy description. I didn't study 5-methoxy. My distinction of the two states being based on those two drugs didn't come about because of those two, drugs, but more as a result of, thinking about the mystical and the prophetic experience. Okay, so
good times. Thank you so much. I can almost hear all of our participants around the globe applauding. I feel like there's a standing ovation happening throughout the world and throughout the cosmos.
well, I hope so, for the greater good, right? I mean,
Right.
people should be happy.
So we have another room. We've got to clear out this Zoom link for our next talk. I really appreciate you being here. If you want to like kibitz with the people, we have another virtual space where you can like hang out, and it's almost like Zoom, but you can walk around with your little bubble. And so if you feel like doing that, I'll put it in here for you as long as you have a Chrome browser.
I've got Chrome and I've got some time. So this is going to be going on now.
This room has been open. It will be open all weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of like our virtual hallway because, like sometimes the best part of the conferences is who you meet in the hallways. And so the folks at Ozo have been very kind and they've given us a virtual hallway. And except you're in outer space. It looks like you're in outer space.
Right. Yeah, I can deal with that. Well, I will, click that and then take a quick bathroom break and be with you in a few minutes.
All right. Well, any last words or thoughts for the faithful?
Well, I'm trying to get more traction for an autobiographical novel I wrote a few years ago called Joseph Levy Escapes Death. And it's kind of a dark medical humor, self-help, my life goes off the rails kind of a book, or the character's life anyway. So I'd like to make a shout out for that book, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. It's on Kindle, Audible, and hard copy.
Okay. With every copy, Dr. Strassman will come over to your house and dose you with DMT while you sleep.
Right. Okay. So I'll see you in a few minutes.
All right. Thanks, everybody.